As hardware prices continue to climb, more and more people are turning to budget options. In my area specifically, I've been seeing an increasing number of people asking for budget systems this year, most of which had these 3 CPUs inside them. Now, none of these CPUs are bad by any means. They are some of the best budget options for modern systems. But what I wanna know is whether or not they can run modern games at 60 plus FPS at 1080p resolution, and is it even worth buying any of them in 2025? For the benchmarks, I'll be pairing these CPUs with a B760 motherboard, 32GB of RAM, and an RTX 4070 to make sure that we don't run into any bottlenecks. Let's begin with CS2. For this game, I just went with medium settings at 1080p resolution. I jumped into a deathmatch against bots and played it for about 10 minutes. I even walked similar paths to make these tests as fair as possible, and if we take a look at the numbers, we'll notice that all 3 of these CPUs handle the game quite well. The lowest 0.1% low that I saw was 83 FPS on the i3-12100F, and the averages were around 200. Obviously no stutters. All of these CPUs are powerful enough in that regard. By the way, it's also worth mentioning that i3-14100F ran the hottest in our tests. I even used the same thermal paste and the same cooler with Ares CPU. All the BIOS settings were set to default and the XMP profile was enabled. So the only variable in our tests were the CPUs themselves. Forza Horizon 5. In this game, I'm gonna set the graphics to medium at 1080p resolution. I'll be keeping the graphics pretty low in all of these tests, by the way, because I wanna avoid the possibility of having a GPU bottleneck. I mean, RTX 4070 is powerful enough to prevent that from happening, but setting the graphics higher only increases that chance. And no, I don't have a more powerful GPU, so I'm just gonna make the best use of what I have at the moment. Anyway, in this built-in benchmark, we got pretty consistent 0.1% lows on all CPUs. The differences were also similar to what we saw in CS2. Now, at this point, I started seeing a repeating pattern here. i3-12100F always kept being the lowest in temperature, followed up with the i5-12400F, and then i3-14100F was the hottest. The FPS results were also pretty consistent. The i3-12100F was the lowest performing CPU, followed up with the i3-14100F, and the i5-12400F scored the highest in all of the tests so far. In Doom Eternal, on the other hand, our i3-14100F didn't really get much more FPS than the i3-12100F, which is weird because we weren't really GPU bottlenecked. I mean, the i5 did get more FPS, which is a better CPU, so if we were bottlenecked by the GPU, it would have been obvious in these tests as well. But somehow, both of our i3s achieved the same FPS on average. Now, of course, there will always be variables in these gameplay benchmarks. We cannot control how many monsters will spawn at what point. Although I did double check just to be safe, but the results were still the same. The i3-14100F kept getting the same FPS as the i3-12100F. I mean, sometimes I did get 1 or 2 more average FPS on the 14100F, but the results were mostly the same. These 2 CPUs kept getting around the same FPS in this game. Cyberpunk 2077. Here I went with the low preset at native 1080p resolution. Now, before we take a look at the results, I wanna let you guys know that there is a bug in this game that still hasn't been fixed to this day. The bug is where the game doesn't really save the graphical settings sometimes, but thankfully I was able to replicate it and get it fixed for the benchmarks, so we don't have to worry about that for now. With that said, if we take a look at the numbers on the screen, we'll notice that there's a pretty reasonable difference between all 3 of these CPUs. In this built-in benchmark, the i3-12100F achieved 153 FPS on average with pretty good 1% lows. The 14100F on the other hand increased that number to 161, And of course, our i5 scored the highest, achieving a whopping 176 FPS on average with both 1% and 0.1% lows being above 100. Pretty good results overall for a demanding game. And no, I can't really test these games on higher settings. This RTX 4070 is already reaching 80 to 90% utilization in these games. If I set the graphics even a tiny bit higher, we're gonna start getting bottlenecked by the GPU. So to prevent that from happening, we have to keep the settings on low. Hogwarts Legacy. In this game I went with medium settings at 1080p resolution. Now since we don't have a built-in benchmark here, I decided to run from one place to another to avoid any variables. Fights can be pretty random at times, and I wanted to reduce that randomness as much as possible. With that said, if we take a look at the numbers, we'll notice that there's not a huge difference between any of these CPUs. I mean, don't get me wrong, 5 FPS gap between the i3s is respectable, but the i5 12400F is not doing so hot in terms of average FPS. In some of the other games that we've tested so far, the i5 has given us a lot better results than what we're seeing right now. But nevertheless, it still gave us the highest FPS in every single test in comparison to the i3s. The last game for today's benchmarks is Warhammer 40k Space Marine 2. Now, I didn't necessarily test this game at the exact same spot as I did with other games, which will introduce some randomness to our tests, but I played it for about 15 minutes on each CPU, so the results should still be quite valid. On the low preset at 1080p resolution, the i5 12400F and i3 14100F did pretty well in our tests. Both CPUs managed to keep the FPS above 60 at all times. But the i3 12100F on the other hand didn't really do as well as I thought it would. Even though we got 67 FPS on average, it still went below 60 in some areas, which was not only noticeable in the gameplay, but it was also kinda weird. i3 14100F and 12100F CPUs are not that far apart in terms of gaming performance, but somewhy the i3 12100F scored noticeably lower in comparison to the 14100F. Let's summarize all the results that we've gathered so far. In all of the games that we've tested today, the i5 got the highest FPS, followed up with the i3 14100F, and then i3 12100F scored the lowest. I didn't see any stutters or weird behavior from any of these CPUs, but I did notice that the 12th Gen i3 scored a bit lower than I anticipated in Space Marine 2. Regardless though, I still think that all of these CPUs are fine for modern gaming. If you're looking to buy any of them in 2025, then you should be quite satisfied with the gaming results, especially if you go for the i5. But do keep in mind that these are the cheapest CPUs that are available right now on the LGA 1700 platform. There are a bunch of other options if you do decide to go for a used CPU, or if you are a Ryzen enjoyer like me, you can check the AMD side of the market as well. I'll be doing even more comparisons in the future, but for now, this is all I have to offer. Thank you so much for watching, and as always, I'm gonna see you guys in the next one. Bye bye.